Exact Ezekiel Chapters 23-24. Introduction. This chapter brings the hearer a step down from the previous appraisal of Israel's character, as seen by the living Lord. Israel's self-appraisal would never have included seeing themselves and their religious piety in terms of being idolatrous, let alone adulteress. Now the Lord calls them prostitutes. God's contempt for their wholesale mindset is clearly seen in this new indictment. To be an adulterer is one thing, but to be called idolatrous prostitutes is another. Prostitution is based on an illicit transaction and is about selling oneself for gain, fame or money. Men and women are known to prostitute themselves for favor or fame or monetary gain. Politicians and churchmen do the same, for the same reasons. Whatever their reasoning, the result is identical, a liaison at the lowest level. More and more, the Gomez syndrome of Hosea manifested itself in the affairs of God's chosen people. Covenant with God slowly meant nothing to them. His love was spurned for a sordid, temporary fix. Once one identifies with the role of a prostitute, no action is deemed as inappropriate behavior. All parties associated with the prostitute's transaction are tainted by such activity, and God was not willing to be a part of it. His solution is spelled out in this 23rd chapter. It opens by answering the unspoken question revolving around his accusation. In essence it says, "You ask me, when did we prostitute ourselves?" In the 23rd chapter, he tells them where and when. Chapter 23. Ezekiel chapter 23 verses 1 through 4. This message came to me from the Lord, Son of man. Once there were two sisters who were daughters of the same mother. They became prostitutes in Egypt. Even as young girls, they allowed themselves to be fondled and caressed. The older girl was named Oholah, and her sister was Oholibah. I married them, and they bore me sons and daughters. I am speaking of Samaria and Jerusalem, for Oholah is Samaria and Oholibah is Jerusalem. In these opening lines, the persons of interest are identified. They are Samaria and Jerusalem, the 10 tribes of the north, now captured and carried off to Assyria and later dispersed to every nation, and Judah, Benjamin, the southern tribes. They have the same mother, Sarah, and they have the Isaac and Jacob lineage. Israel's time in Egypt was a time when they became acculturated into society. They witnessed enticements that competed with their God. They learned to allow themselves to be spiritually abused under the guise of receiving favors from their enslavers. Those who came to Egypt in their innocence learned how to manipulate their seduction for advantage. O church, could this not be said of you? God, like Hosea, married them anyway, as they matured. But, what they had learned in Egypt did not leave them, even though God's love surrounded them. The Joseph years of prosperity saw many children born to this union. Israel entered Egypt as a few, but departed Egypt as a multitude. However, it soon became evident that Moses led a people who could witness deliverance of gargantuan scale and turn to say, "Why did you have us leave a pleasant land to die in the desert?" O to Samaria, Oholah. Ezekiel chapter 23 verses 5 through 10. Then Oholah lusted after other lovers instead of me, and she gave her love to the Assyrians, her neighbors. They were all attractive young men, captains and commanders dressed in handsome blue, dashing about on their horses. And so she prostituted herself with the most desirable men of Assyria, worshipping their idols and defiling herself. For when she left Egypt, she did not leave her spirit of prostitution behind. She was still as lewd as in her youth, when the Egyptians satisfied their lusts with her and robbed her of her virginity. And so I handed her over to her Assyrian lovers, whom she desired so much. They stripped her and killed her and took away her children as their slaves. Her name was known to every woman in the land as a sinner who had received what she deserved. Oholah made treaties with Assyria which led to her enslavement. Their flashy army offered protection and security. The 10 northern tribes were betrayed and carried away to captivity in a foreign land, which eventually disintegrated, and they were scattered over the Caucasus and spread to every nation, carrying their youthful lessons with them. The other 2 tribes cared less. They said, "She got what she deserved." Prostitutes, Judah, grow calloused. Church, have you been seduced, captured and enslaved while the world claps in approval? Liaisons are like that. Ode to Judah, Oholibah. Ezekiel chapter 23 verses 11 through 13. Yet even though Oholibah saw what had happened to Oholibah, her sister, she followed right in her footsteps. And she was even more depraved, abandoning herself to her lust and prostitution. She fawned over her Assyrian neighbors, those handsome young men on fine horses, those captains and commanders in handsome uniforms, all of them desirable. I saw the way she was going, defiling herself just like her older sister. Jerusalem made treaties with Babylon, Assyria, and Egypt, at different times, to ensure protection. They emptied their coffers and gave away the treasures of Solomon's temple. Earlier in Ezekiel, discussion was made about these alliances. These liaisons yielded nothing as all the governments failed to honor their word. Hence, they were weakened to the point they were enslaved in Babylon. The following passage tells about this betrayal. Oholibah's escape from reality gave her a false picture of her lover's abilities. She foolishly embraced a false construct, based on a fantasized picture projected on the wall of her devotions. Ezekiel chapter 23 verses 14 through 17. Then she carried her prostitution even further. She fell in love with pictures that were painted on a wall, pictures of Babylonian military officers, outfitted in striking red uniforms. Handsome belts encircled their waists, and flowing turbans crowned their heads. They were dressed like chariot officers from the land of Babylonia. When she saw these paintings, she longed to give herself to them, so she sent messengers to Babylonia to invite them to come to her. So they came and committed adultery with her, defiling her in the bed of love. But later, she became disgusted with them and broke off their relationship. The brochures oversold the product. Illusions are like that. Remember, this prophecy is aimed at the church crowd gathered in Ezekiel's home to hear from God. Is it easy to be duped? The golden calf was still in their hearts, even though it had been centuries since the Exodus. Notice how Oholibah was disgusted with her lying liaisons, just as God was disgusted with Oholibah. With Egypt on her mind, she was blind to the facts of her condition. O church, can this be said of you? Ezekiel chapter 23 verses 18 through 21. So I became disgusted with Oholibah, just as I was with her sister, because she flaunted herself before them and gave herself to satisfy their lusts. But that didn't bother her. She turned to even greater prostitution, remembering her youth when she was a prostitute in Egypt. She lusted after lovers whose attentions were gross and bestial. And so, Oholibah, you celebrated your former days as a young girl in Egypt, when you first allowed yourself to be fondled and caressed. Virgin innocence is not recoverable. Ezekiel chapter 23 verses 22 through 27. Therefore, Oholibah, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will send your lovers against you, those very nations from which you turned away in disgust. For the Babylonians will come with all the Chaldeans from Pekod and Shur and Co. And all the Assyrians will come with them, handsome young captains, commanders, chariot officers, and other high-ranking officers, riding their horses. They will all come against you from the north with chariots, wagons, and a great army fully prepared for attack. They will take up positions on every side, surrounding you with men armed for battle. And I will hand you over to them so they can do with you as they please. I will turn my jealous anger against you, and they will deal furiously with you. They will cut off your nose and ears, and any survivors will then be slaughtered by the sword. Your children will be taken away as captives, and everything that is left will be burned. They will strip you of your beautiful clothes and jewels, In this way, I will put a stop to the lewdness and prostitution you brought from Egypt. You will never again cast longing eyes on those things or fondly remember your time in Egypt. The reference to noses and ears being cut off speaks to the luxury places where the well-attired female had nose ornaments and earrings. Those items have made a comeback. A beachhead was established in this passage, however, that would turn the significance of the battle around. The leaders and elders needed to know God was the author of their captivity, not the ambitions of the Babylonians and Assyrians. They needed to know why they were enslaved in Babylon. It was to cleanse them. What they had in Egypt would no longer be on their mind. O church, there is a soon coming cleansing in order for a chaste bride to emerge. The son will not marry a prostitute. Ezekiel chapter 23 verses 28 through 35. For this is what the sovereign Lord says, I will surely hand you over to your enemies, to those you loathe. They will deal with you in hatred and rob you of all you own, leaving you naked and bare. The shame of your prostitution will be exposed to all the world. You brought all this on yourself by prostituting yourself to other nations, defiling yourself with all their idols. Because you have followed in your sister's footsteps, I will punish you with the same terrors that destroyed her. Yes, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You will drink from the same cup of terror as your sister, a cup that is large and deep. And all the world will mock and scorn you in your desolation. You will reel like a drunkard beneath the awful blows of sorrow and distress, just as your sister Samaria did. In deep anguish you will drain that cup of terror to the very bottom. Then you will smash it to pieces and beat your breast in anguish. For I, the sovereign Lord, have spoken. And because you have forgotten me and turned your back on me, says the sovereign Lord, you must bear the consequences of all your lewdness and prostitution. Judah smirked when Samaria was taken captive years before. Now she will be dispersed throughout the nations just like the 10 northern tribes. Who was to blame? They were. How far-reaching is this punishment to be? It would be beyond their imagination. However, their assumed denial of conditions was to be shattered by the prophets in their face accusations. Ezekiel was to confront the elders with God's list of grievances against them. He was to spare no one. Simply put, while standing in front of those from Samaria, who might have lived in Jerusalem and escaped the diaspora caused by Assyria, they would not escape God's scathing indictment this time. Ezekiel chapter 23 verses 36 through 39. The Lord said to me, Son of man, you must accuse Olah and Oholiab of all their awful deeds. They have committed both adultery and murder, adultery by worshipping idols and murder by burning their children as sacrifices on their altars. Then after doing these terrible things, they defiled my temple and violated my Sabbath day. On the very day that they murdered their children in front of their idols, they boldly came into my temple to worship. They came in and defiled my house. Perhaps the word accuse carries more than a pointed finger of rebuke. According to the Hebrew words associated with it, it involved casting aside protocol or rank and clearly stating God's view of their religious community and those individuals responsible. Ezekiel was to leave nothing out, but make sure every aspect is openly exposed. Old Testament, 5046 accuse. Norgad, a primitive root, properly, to front, stand boldly out opposite, by implication, causatively, to manifest, figuratively, to announce, always by word of mouth to one present, specifically, to expose, predict, explain, praise, or not praise. King James Version, betray, certainly, certify, declare, declaring, denounce, expound fully, messenger, plainly, profess, rehearse, report, show, forth, speak, surely, tell, utter. BibleSoft's new exhaustive Strong's Numbers and Concordance with Expanded Greek Hebrew Dictionary. Copyright 1994, 2003 BibleSoft, Incorporate, and International Bible Translators, Incorporate. The true man of God has a duty not to gloss over the deeds of sin. Conviction comes when he is faithful to God's text. Which of the first list, verses 36 through 39, would not be a description of current society? Adultery with what is often determined to be just part of the culture becomes acceptable behavior, even if it violates the word of God. A murderous abortion, in the millions, finds no appeasement from the Most High. This trilogy of darkness also includes disregard for the sacred things of God, defiling the temple and breaking the Sabbath. The worst-case scenario is found in verse 39, which uncovers the raw hypocrisy of the religious community. Acting as if God doesn't care, they entered the sanctuary of praise just after worshipping idols and burning their children. Their nonchalance expressed a total disregard for the holiness of His presence. O Church, is this not repeated weekly, almost daily, in the realms of ecclesia? What would God list today? Would His list include coming before Him laden with sin and never occasioning repentance? Samaria and Judah must now drink the wine of judgment. Review the following verses. Ezekiel chapter 23 verses 40 through 45. You sisters sent messengers to distant lands to get men. Then when they arrived, you bathed yourselves, painted your eyelids, and put on your finest jewels for them. You sat with them on a beautifully embroidered couch and put my incense and my oil on a table that was spread before you. From your room came the sound of many men carousing. They were lustful men and drunkards from the wilderness, who put bracelets on your wrists and beautiful crowns on your heads. Then I said, if they really want to sleep with worn-out, old prostitutes like these, let them. And that is what they did. They slept with Ola and Oholiba, these shameless prostitutes, with all the zest of lustful young men. But righteous people will judge these sister cities for what they really are, adulteresses and murderers. They will sentence them to all the punishment they deserve. Verses 40 through 44 describe a whole nation who made treaties and gave their treasures to the likes of Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon. Even the Lord seemed put off with those nations who favored Israel. Those are the three nations who slept with the prostitutes. God called Israel old prostitutes, who were worn out. One of the reasons those nations fell in history was their being one in the flesh with Israel's prostitution. Verse 45 is a powerful incentive to live a righteous life in these end-time days. Clearly, the righteous have untainted vision and judge in holiness. They are tasked to judge these adulterers and murderers. This is a clear picture of the righteous being outside the religious spectrum. The righteous are separate from the norm of piety sprinkled with compromise. They sentence Samaria and Judah to all the punishment they deserve. Where are the righteous today? Where are their righteous judgments? The revival bandied about in these days must start with the inkhorn in the temple marking the righteous and showing the need for repentance to the rest. Ezekiel chapter 23 verses 46 through 49. Now this is what the sovereign Lord says, bring an army against them and hand them over to be terrorized and plundered. For their enemies will stone them and kill them with swords. They will butcher their sons and daughters and burn their homes. In this way, I will put an end to lewdness and idolatry in the land, and my judgment will be a warning to others not to follow their wicked example. You will be fully repaid for all your prostitution, your worship of idols. Yes, you will suffer the full penalty. Then you will know that I am the sovereign Lord. Full punishment did fall on Israel. Several months before Jerusalem was burned and the temple destroyed, Ezekiel was again answering the question, how in the world did we wind up here? God carried out the sentence of the righteous, by fully destroying the nation. Why is it important to study the prophets? How is the Old Testament important to those of modern times? The answer is given in verse 48 as a warning to others not to follow their wicked example. O church, are we not perilously close to emulating them? This warning is like that of Sodom, It is a universal roadblock with a written notice, "Don't travel this road for it leads to destruction." Chapter 24. Ezekiel chapter 24 verse 1. On January 15th, during the 9th year of King Jehoiachin's captivity, this message came to me from the Lord. Since this was dated as the 9th year of Jehoiachin's captivity and Zedekiah reigned 11 years after his overturn, this meant the year was 588 B.C. There are yet 2 years until the burning of Jerusalem. January 15th witnessed a cold winter day in Jerusalem, as the chilling message was given to the elders. Sometimes, exact dates are historically important. We mark them when wars start and aggressive behavior begins or ends among nations. We celebrate victories by calendaring holidays commemorating various historic events. So, God instructed Ezekiel to mark down this date as a most important date. Mind the matter, for Ezekiel was hundreds of miles from Jerusalem in a day when mass communication was not invented. He was told this day is important because Babylon began their final assault against Jerusalem on this day, which was an assault that would last 2 years and bring mass destruction to the population. Babylon was angered at Jerusalem's resistance and eventually they attacked Egypt and took authority over it. Because of their collusion with Judah, Jeremiah had something to say about this ordeal of death. Hear him in this passage. Jeremiah chapter 52 verses 4 through 9. So in the 9th year of Zedekiah's reign, on the 10th day of the 10th month, Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon marched against Jerusalem with his whole army. They camped outside the city and built siege works all around it. The city was kept under siege until the 11th year of King Zedekiah. By the 9th day of the 4th month the famine in the city had become so severe that there was no food for the people to eat. Then the city wall was broken through, and the whole army fled. They left the city at night through the gate between the 2 walls near the king's garden, though the Babylonians were surrounding the city. They fled toward the Arabah, but the Babylonian army pursued King Zedekiah and overtook him in the plains of Jericho. All his soldiers were separated from him and scattered, and he was captured. He was taken to the king of Babylon in Riblah in the land of Hamath. The day on which Nebuchadnezzar blockaded the city of Jerusalem, by throwing up a rampart, is still kept as a fast day in consequence. Zechariah chapter 8 verse 19. From Keel and Delet's Commentary on the Old Testament, New Updated Edition, Electronic Database. Copyright 1996 by Hendrickson Publishers, Incorporate. Every citizen of the city would be in jeopardy of sword, famine and fire. 2 years of supplies being interrupted caused their citizens to starve. The razing of the city was heartbreaking to those who cherished our heritage. Unfortunately, God was saying through his servant, there is nothing to be done now. This judgment is sure and prayer would not avail. Boiling pot of corruption. Remember, there were no news agencies to report on the conditions that occurred in Jerusalem and no interpretation of on-the-ground activities during the siege. Except Jeremiah, who was many miles away in the city. The all-knowing God proffered an illustration that would be imprinted on the audience at hand and would act as an unforgettable commentary on the events of punishment. It was a boiling pot of corruption. The scene had several ingredients, but the overall take was simple. This was an illustration which involved everyone from the elite upper classes, choice lambs, to the lowest inhabitant. The mention of various parts of the choice meats indicate a cream of the crop stew being boiled by the fires of war. Bones and flesh were separated in the corrupt pot, dividing the soul and the spirit. Religious hierarchy, along with the elders of the people, formed the horrid mix. Ezekiel chapter 24 verses 2 through 8. Then show these rebels an illustration, give them a message from the sovereign Lord. Put a pot of water on the fire to boil. Fill it with choice meat, the rump and the shoulder and all the most tender cuts. Use only the best sheep from the flock and heap fuel on the fire beneath the pot. Bring the pot to a boil, and cook the bones along with the meat. Now this is what the sovereign Lord says: destruction is certain for Jerusalem, the city of murderers. She is a pot filled with corruption. So take the meat out chunk by chunk in whatever order it comes, for her wickedness is evident to all. She murders boldly, leaving blood on the rocks for all to see. She doesn't even try to cover it. So I will splash her blood on a rock as an open expression of my anger and vengeance against her. By randomly dipping into the pot in no apparent order, the stage was set for a lesson in the school of hard knocks. We might use a different phrase today. We might say, anyway you cut it, everyone is involved. Ezekiel chapter 24 verses 9 through 14. This is what the sovereign Lord says: destruction is certain for Jerusalem, the city of murderers. I myself will pile up the fuel beneath her. Yes, heap on the wood. Let the fire roar to make the pot boil. Cook the meat well with many spices. Then empty the pot and burn the bones. Now set the empty pot on the coals to scorch away the filth and corruption. But it's helpless. The corruption remains. So throw it into the fire. It is the filth and corruption of your lewdness and idolatry. And now, because I tried to cleanse you but you refused, you will remain filthy until my fury against you has been satisfied. I, the Lord, have spoken. The time has come and I won't hold back. I will not change my mind. You will be judged on the basis of all your wicked actions, says the sovereign Lord. Two very distinct aspects can be learned from the scriptures above. 1. God is the power behind this judgment. He wants it clearly understood this captivity and war is his doing. It is not the aggression of a Babylonian dictatorship seeking conquest over them. It is also not some grand conspiracy of the Assyrians, Edomites, Jebusites or Canaanites. None of Israel's enemies are responsible for their plight. He takes full responsibility for the boiling pot, and no amount of cleansing makes a difference at this point in time. Jerusalem was corrupt going in, during and coming out. Even the pot, Jerusalem, would not be cleansed once they were judged. Lewdness and idolatry proliferated every fiber and sinew of their being, and no matter what order would be chosen, not one piece of the stew exuded anything but the stench of corruption. 2. The Lord tried to cleanse them, but they refused. By sending Joel 835 B.C., Amos 760 B.C., Hosea 755 B.C., Isaiah 740 B.C., Micah 735 B.C., Zephaniah 639 B.C., Jeremiah 627 B.C., Habakkuk 607 B.C., Daniel 605 B.C., and finally Ezekiel 592 B.C. He sought them out. 242 years of prophetic pleading was sent to no avail. O church, there is a lesson to be learned here, for when one remembers Whitfield, Edwards, Moody, and Finney, the Lord again was sending his messengers. The trail of revivalists from Wesley to Billy Sunday and Billy Graham tell the tale of God's desire for a converted born-again society. Alas, look at the scene under the church's present-day watch. There is a constant conspiracy to undermine Christianity, whether through progressive liberalism or unmitigated immigration bringing foreign gods by the thousands. What would be God's judgment of us, given our 200-year history? Exact Ezekiel's awesome task. Ezekiel's dearest treasure would be taken from him. It was a tremendous personal loss in the prophet's life. God instructed him about his reactions. Ezekiel chapter 24 verses 15 through 17. Then this message came to me from the Lord, Son of man, I am going to take away your dearest treasure. Suddenly she will die. Yet you must not show any sorrow. Do not weep, let there be no tears. You may sigh but only quietly. Let there be no wailing at her grave. Do not uncover your head or take off your sandals. Do not perform the rituals of mourning or accept any food brought to you by consoling friends. In my advanced years, I have sought to console many acquaintances in ministry whose wife passed before they did. I am acquainted with their sorrow. Ezekiel's dearest treasure stood beside him through thick and thin. Ezekiel's wife must have entertained and cooked for the many who visited their home. She comforted the prophet, consoled him and embraced his difficult tasks of ministry. He leaned on her strength and treasured her love. God knew how much she meant to him. No book can prepare the wife of a minister. No advice can tell them the many times they must pray for his safety and courage. A prophet's wife dries his tears of joy and sorrow, defends him in the marketplace, shields him from the wrathful inquirer, and lends her personal relationship to God as support, often while remaining in the background. Such is my wife, and I know her many roles and tasks. This awesome loss was the ultimate test of Ezekiel's faithfulness to the word of the Lord. It is after this event that Ezekiel was given the most profound prophecies of his entire ministry. He saw into the distant future and experienced the wonder of things yet to take place. He became a prophet, not to Israel alone, but to the world. God gave him chapters 37, 38, 39 as well as the great teaching on the sons of Zadok in chapter 44. He viewed the holy city of heaven and stood by the river of life and was baptized in it. Ezekiel chapter 24 verses 18 and 19. So I proclaimed this to the people the next morning, and in the evening my wife died. The next morning I did everything I had been told to do. Then the people asked, "What does all this mean? What are you trying to tell us? How often do you tend to depersonalize the prophets?" It is good to look into their lives and examine the cost of being a man of truth with uncompromising adherence to the Word of God. The ministry must never be a profession, it must always be a calling. Note, the underlined portion of the passage, "I did everything I had been told to do." Go ahead, put his shoes on your feet and imagine what cost his soul where only a silent whimper was allowed. Spiritual exactness was a prime factor in the early church. Acts chapter 8 reveals how important it was to Philip and his reward for his faithfulness to it. It is a missing factor today, both in pulpit and pew. God used this event to drive home a greater truth than the corrupt cauldron. Ezekiel chapter 24 verses 20 through 24. So I said to them, "A message came to me from the Lord, and I was told to give this message to the people of Israel. This is what the sovereign Lord says: I will desecrate my temple, the source of your security and pride. Your sons and daughters in Judea will be slaughtered by the sword. Then you will do as Ezekiel has done. You will not mourn in public or console yourselves by eating the food brought to you by sympathetic friends. Your heads must remain covered, and your sandals must not be taken off. You will not mourn or weep, but you will waste away because of your sins. You will mourn privately for all the evil you have done." Ezekiel is an example for you to follow. You will do as he has done. And when that time comes, you will know that I am the Lord. Exact Ezekiel's example was forever emblazoned in their hearts and minds. This grand exclamation stood as a symbol to them and their future generations. Ezekiel chapter 24 verses 25 through 27. Then the Lord said to me, "Son of man, on the day I take away their stronghold, their joy and glory, their heart's desire, their dearest treasure, I will also take away their sons and daughters. And on that day a refugee from Jerusalem will come to you in Babylon and tell you what has happened. And when he arrives, your voice will suddenly return so you can talk to him, and you will be a symbol for these people. Then they will know that I am the Lord." Ezekiel was told he will have an en punto experience with a survivor of the fire. There was a stipulation: your voice will be taken away until he arrives. The sudden return of his voice would signal him that this is the man of occasion. Does God still plan these kinds of meetings where strangers come into your life and you know it is from the Lord? Yes. Hear him, more now than at any time in history. The Spirit will lead you away from harm and to provision.